All right, thank you. Um, so I will present about common approaches to regulating e-waste management and EPR. So I'm from the International Telecommunication Union. I'm the Circular Economy Coordinator. My name is Garam Bell. So the International Telecommunication Union, ITU, is the United Nations specialized agency for information and communication technologies. I'm based in Geneva, in Switzerland. I'm also joined online by my colleague Samir Sharma. He's also participating, and he's based in our regional office in Bangkok of ITU. So ITU has a program where we support countries with the development of regulation on electronic waste. And this is a map of the countries that we've supported in the past and that we will start supporting soon or are already supporting through current ongoing projects on this topic. So, although the mandate of ITU is very much about information, communication, and technology equipment, we recognize that when it comes to regulating electronic waste, it's very important to consider the different products that could be in scope in the regulation. So typically, and this is not always the case, but typically the products that are considered as electrical and electronic equipment and therefore e-waste may be temperature exchange equipment such as cooling and freezing equipment, screens and monitors like televisions, laptops, etc., lamps, large equipment that might include washing machines, electric stoves, printers, etc. Small equipment that might include vacuum cleaners and microwaves, and then small IT and telecommunications equipment like mobile phones or calculators, Wi-Fi routers, etc. But what is typically the case that we've seen in many countries, based on our experience, is that batteries and electric vehicles, for example, parts, electronics from cars, military equipment, etc., are usually excluded from regulation. But with the growth of electric vehicles, we've also actually seen in some countries a consideration where there is no regulation already to include some aspects of that waste stream also in the regulation of e-waste. But typically, globally at the moment, for those countries that do have regulation on this topic, these are the 6 categories generally that we see being covered in the product scope. So in our experience, when supporting countries to develop regulation from the start, it's important to consider the different key stakeholder groups. So I know the previous speaker from PCD mentioned the fact that there are lots of different people to speak to. Some people agree and some people disagree. But typically here, it's important for the consultation and the participatory approach to take as much time as is needed, and the regulation from the start will never be perfect. So it's also important to start and then develop once and to learn once things are in place. So there are some stakeholder groups here that are pretty important. Under the term producer on the left, these might be importers, they might be distributors, they might be manufacturers, they might even be reassemblers. They may, in some cases, also be retailers, and more these days, they are also distance sellers, so entities that are selling products online from another country that don't have a legal representation in the jurisdiction in which their products are being consumed. And Obviously, another really important imperative group in this stakeholder consultation is actually the government, including the other institutions that are affiliated to government, but also national and local ministries, departments, etc. We also, on the top right here, have producer responsibility organizations, also known as, in some countries, compliance schemes. So these can take many different shapes and forms, and I understand we might hear more about PROs later. But here's a brief. They could be for-profit, not-for-profit. There may be a single PRO, multiple PROs, sectoral PROs for different, even within the different sections of e-waste. Let's say, for example, where I am in Switzerland right now, there are 3 PROs, and the PROs are for different sectors. So there is one for lighting, there is one for ICT, there is one for appliances. But all of this list here is also rather important to include in the regulation, so that it's crystal clear how the PRO structure nationally would look. How many, can there be as many as we like? For example, in the United Kingdom, there are nearly 30 compliance schemes. In Italy, I think there are also quite many. But in other countries, we know, for example, in Nigeria, where they are introducing new regulation very recently, there is one PRO, and that is indicated specifically that there is only allowed to be one, and that is in the regulation. So this is also a very important topic, just to manage competition, for example, among the different producer groups. And then obviously the waste managers. So you have different categories here. There might be registered dismantlers, recyclers, collectors, etc. But you also obviously have the informal sector operations. And this is really important, obviously, in the context of Thailand, which we understand also the informal sector is playing a big role currently. And therefore, the regulation typically would have to have some sort of text related to how that integration could happen. There is an example from South Africa, in the regulations in South Africa from 2 or 3 years ago, where there is also a big informal sector in this area. There are texts in the regulation to integrate informal sector into the EPR system through the producer responsibility organizations. Then you have the retailers, and I have put retailer in producer category, but I've also put a separate category for retailer. The reason there is because typically we see the producer being termed, the definition of the producer being the first entity that places the equipment on the market. So that can sometimes be a retailer if they're bringing it into the country directly themselves, but they may also be purchasing it from somebody else within the country who has already brought that equipment onto the market. So it's really important in the regulation to be very clear on at what point is the fee or the obligation on a particular entity starting. When is that starting? So retailers can be these kind of brick and mortar. That means like a physical retailer on the street or an online seller, but also, as I mentioned, a producer. So then we have the civil society, obviously non-governmental organizations, community-based institutions, and academia, universities and research institutions. And then the last group that we've put here collectively is the consumer. And here it's also very important to recognize that the government is a huge consumer of electrical and electronic equipment, and then so are many companies and big office spaces. So in some instances, regulations do have provisions for these types of consumers. And I know that in Dominican Republic, where ITU supported the enactment of a regulation there. There is a lot of emphasis also on bulk and individual consumers, but in particular on bulk. And in that sense, it's very important to define what is the definition of a bulk consumer. So just very briefly defining a producer. So we see the common themes are that in law, that it's the entity that introduces, and that's what I said before, the entity that places something on the market for the first time. It's a manufacturer, an importer, a distributor, a brand owner, a franchisee, an assembler, or a retailer. These are typical terms. For any commercial manufacture or even conversion or refurbishment or import, new and used. So conversion being that the product might already have been in flotation in the market, and then an entity brings that product back to life and places it back on the market. That's an area where there is a need to have clarity in the regulation, but also on the importation. Some countries, and I don't know whether this is the case in Thailand or not, but in some cases, in some countries, there are also heavily dependent on the importation of used equipment, which is then to be consumed. So that's also a bracket that is included under the importer typically in some countries. Then obviously any natural or legal persons. And I think that's also really important because we do see in some countries that it's not just the entity, but it's also the individual. So in some countries, we do see the definition of producer, including also the terms donation, gifts, inheritance. So that's just to exemplify that it's not just a company, let's say, in the eyes of the law in some countries around the world. I mentioned also earlier the emerging issue of distant sellers with no legal representation in the jurisdiction of the equipment being placed on the market. That's also an emerging issue. I put two photographs on the right-hand side. So the one with the ship is obviously depicting import and trade, and the other one with the micro manufacturing there, production, is representing the manufacturing side. And I think it's important to reflect on these two images when thinking about the producer, because we've seen in some countries that the definition has been a bit misguided, and everybody thinks that producer is simply meaning like the manufacturer or the brand owner, at least in the English language. But actually 90% of, let's say, all countries in the world are basically net importers anyway. Although we know that in Thailand there is also a significant manufacturing industry for certain electrical equipment. But it's very important to consider these two photos and what they actually mean when it comes to defining a producer. So I'm not sure how much time I have left, but I'll maybe need 5 more minutes. I want to just move on to the drafting of regulation. So when drafting regulation, it's really important to be clear and concise. So to leave no room for interpretation, and to have clarity, and to reduce barriers, and to improve efficiency in the system. So when we draft regulation, we should think about what the system looks like in terms of implementation already at that point in time, rather than draft the regulation, have it a nice piece of paper with words, and then once it's approved by cabinet or the state, to then think about implementation. They must happen at the same time of drafting. Stakeholders must know what their role is, including the government stakeholders. And it was very good to hear from PCD about the roles of, for example, PCD and others also in the regulation. Regulations typically say what, when, and who. And when it comes to EPR, where there's a lot of complex information, it may be appropriate also to have some kind of guidelines that are not part of the regulation that say why and how. So have a bit more detail, just so the regulation can remain very clear and efficient. So just to summarize, I have a checklist on the left. What needs to go in the regulation? Clear definitions of the stakeholders in the e-waste value chain, clear roles and responsibilities of each stakeholder, clear scope of the products to be included, clear stipulations on enforcement measures and penalties for non-compliance, details on the financing mechanisms and the institutional structures such as PROs, and clear stipulations on who is covering the costs of e-waste management. So I'll be very quick with this slide because I understand that this might be covered after me. But EPR is typically following two types, and in most countries, the EPR system is mandatory, therefore depicted in the regulation. The two types are typically individual producer responsibility and collective producer responsibility. Individual is where each producer is responsible for collecting and recycling their own products. This is ideally good for eco-design because it means that they have control over their supply chain and their reverse logistics, and they're incentivized to build this into the end of life. But it also means that there's higher costs and there's a lack of economy of scale, and the company itself, the producer itself, must also have economies of scale from the very start for this to be viable. But then we also have the collective producer responsibility, and I think that's also what we were talking about earlier with the PCD presentation about the PRO. And this is typically more common, a lot more common. It's more efficient. It means that you have more than one producer as part of the scheme, but it can dilute the incentives for eco-design, since this responsibility for eco-design, which is what EPR first came about as a policy principle, this idea of eco-design is kind of a bit left behind, let's say, with a focus more on collection and recycling when we have the collective PRO. So EPR in regulation, again, I'll be very quick. It's important to ensure balanced competition to provide a cost-effective and environmentally sound system, and that should be reflected when referring to EPR in the regulation. Enable awareness and enforcement, so with clearly defined responsibilities for all stakeholders, as this will also reduce non-compliance. Ensure a low burden of administration. So that's also really important. The producers know the market, they know the system, so they know the costs, they know how to operate. So the lower the administrative burden for them, the better, let's say, for the system, as long as there's that element of enforcement and oversight by the government, because administrative burdens would normally hinder compliance and increase the costs for the producers, therefore increase the cost for the system, and therefore reduce the cost that would be being allocated to actually managing the e-waste and raising awareness. And then facilitating international harmonization. This makes monitoring and comparison with other countries much easier for legislators, but it also helps with producers having the similar requirements across different countries. We know that many of the producers in Thailand will also be producers in other countries in the region. So financing EPR. Financing can be managed by either government or producers. Who pays, who collects, and the methodology to be written in the regulation or in the guidelines are really important. The applicable penalties, as I mentioned, must also be written in the law, and the separation of registration of producers and of payment or their combination must be clearly guided. So registration and payment, do they happen at the same time, or do they happen separately? Do they happen with the same entity, or do they happen with separate entities? Some key questions to consider for the financing side in the regulation for EPR. What is the financing mechanism being applied? What is the frequency of payment? Who is paying who? What is the financial flow, and what will the fee to be collected support? Will penalties for non-compliance be higher or lower than the fees? And what is the basis of the fees and the methodology that's being used to calculate the amount to be paid? So I think this is my last slide. I just wanted to say that ITU is going to be in a position to provide some support to this process that was outlined by PCD. We do, in fact, have a very small project, but hopefully we can contribute through some way or other by proposing some technical contributions to this discussion, not just to the regulation, but to the overall legal, administrative, and financial EPR system around the regulation for e-waste, and we look forward very much to any collaboration on that in the future. But with that, I'll stop and I'll hand back to the room. Thank you very much.